Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dr. Bahuma Kabisan-Titanji. I am a physician scientist and an infectious diseases fellow at Emory University in Atlanta. I'm also an academic editor for PLOS Global Public Health. It is my absolute pleasure to be moderating this webinar today on innovation and access for COVID-19 therapeutics that is hosted by DNDi, Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. This will be a 1-hour event and there will be no presentations, and we're hoping that this will be more of a conversation with our amazing panelists, which I will be introducing later. Just some housekeeping notes before we get started. The current webinar is being recorded, and we will invite the audience that's joining us to please ask questions by using the chat function to ask your questions. And we'll make sure that we try to fit in and field as many of these questions as we can over the course of the next hour. As we are all very acutely aware, global vaccine inequity remains a big challenge and has been really highlighted by the current COVID-19 pandemic. There is a real urgent need to continue to address the challenges to make sure that everyone everywhere is able to access these life-saving interventions. But the need for treatments for COVID-19 is also more urgent than ever, especially when we consider the emergence of variants of concern, the concerns around waning immunity for the vaccines that we currently have available, and the continuing and enduring inequity in making vaccines widely available to everyone around the world. As many of us who work in infectious diseases and global public health know too well, we cannot fight an infectious diseases pandemic with just one single tool. We need to be able to combine the interventions we have, which would include vaccines, therapeutics, as well as accessibility to diagnostics, supplies, and devices, to pull together the resources and place ourselves in the best position possible in order to be able to address the global pandemic. Yet it has been recently highlighted by the DND policy report, which I invite you all to read, that there is a need for treatments at all stages of COVID-19 and that the therapeutics aspect has been relatively neglected in our global response to the pandemic. The few treatments that have been authorized for COVID-19, unfortunately, only remain widely accessible and available in high-income countries. And these treatments I'm talking about are things like monoclonal antibodies, which tend to be very expensive and not accessible to everyone. More recently, there has been some good and bad news in terms of new antiviral treatments that are coming down the pike. But with some of the challenges that have affected equitable access to vaccines, we worry that some of these challenges would also affect equitable access, affordability, and availability to these therapeutics when they do become available. How can we best address both the promise and pitfalls of the past year and a half when it comes to treatments for COVID-19? How can these lessons help us shape our response to future pandemics? And I hope that over the course of the next hour, we will have an interesting conversation with lots to think about with our fantastic group of panelists, which I'm delighted to introduce. So joining us today, we have Dr. Marie-Paule Quinet, who is here with us today in her capacity as chair of the board of DNDi. And she is also director of research at France's Public Health Research Institute in CERN. Dr. Ayoade Alakija is co-chair of the African Union's African Vaccine Delivery Alliance. Ms. Lois Pace is the director of the Office of Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And Dr. Mariangela Simao is Assistant Director General for Access for Medicines, Vaccines, and Pharmaceuticals at the World Health Organization. To get us started, and I would like to ask some opening questions to our panelists, and turning to Dr. Quinet. For the last several months, DNDi has been trying to draw attention to the need for treatments as well as diagnostics in addition to vaccines. Can you talk a bit about what DNDi itself is doing to respond to COVID-19 and why you are concerned that there is a very narrow window of opportunity for us to ensure that the new therapeutics that are being developed are available and accessible to the world?
Thank you very much for this question. Of course, everybody these days are concerned about vaccines. And of course, I agree, vaccines are important, but we should absolutely not forget about diagnostic and therapeutics in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, DNDi focus and expertise for more than 15 years has been on therapies. But our teams mobilized therefore quickly last year in 2020 to react to the pandemic through 4 main actions. So first, we helped to mobilize a coalition, primarily of low and medium income country researchers, but not only, to focus on accelerating the research agenda in these countries. Second, we set up the largest adaptive platform trial in Africa, which is named ANTICOV, to identify through clinical research effective treatment for early, mild to moderate outpatients. Third, working with multiple consortia, including with the Open Drug Discovery Initiative COVID Moonshot and also the ACT-A International Initiative, we work to identify novel early stage components with promise for COVID-19 treatment. And finally, 4, we engage with policymakers as we do very regularly and advocated for innovation and equitable access to therapies, and not only to therapies, but also to all the others needed COVID-19 tools and technologies. So, of course, many of the challenges that we've seen in relation to the R&D system and access to vaccine, diagnostic, and therapeutics for COVID-19 are acute examples of the chronic failures that WHO, DNDi, and our partners have faced and worked to overcome for neglected population over the past 2 decades, at least 2 decades. But the scientific response to COVID-19 has been unparalleled. We've seen major advances in the development of new health technologies, particularly vaccine, of course, and diagnostics, at an unprecedented speed. Can you think that? Less than a year between the start, the recognition of and the knowledge of what is the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the deployment of vaccine. This is incredible, unprecedented, with shortening clinical development and regulatory timelines and quickly validating platform technologies and modality in a way that has been truly transformative. But in spite of this glorious science success, we are all aware of a striking and unacceptable inequity in access to the vaccine that have been developed. We now see the slow catch-up of low-income countries, and in particular, sub-Saharan Africa, which is by far lagging behind the most, to protect their population against the pandemic. We have not seen the same kind of scientific progress, unfortunately, when it comes to treatment, but there has been recent progress in this area. There is therefore a short window of opportunity to not repeat what we have seen for vaccine and to ensure that new treatments for COVID-19 are developed and made available in a spirit of global equity and solidarity. We worry, of course, that we may start to see some of the same behaviors that have led to any unequal access. But this is why action is needing now. Now, at this moment, we shouldn't wait, because while we are finally seeing promising treatment, we need to advocate and all together to persuade the world and decision makers that to be protected against the pandemic, to be treated for disease, we need to be all treated. And this should start now through allowing purchase and stockpiling of the treatment for the need of low and medium income countries, at a price that this country can offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kine. And I think that your opening remarks segue quite nicely to the question that I'm going to ask Dr. Alakija. Dr. Alakija, there's been a lot of focus, and rightly so, on the access to vaccines in Africa, which has been mired with a lot of inequity. But we hear less about how communities and political leaders in African countries are viewing the need for treatments. Can you comment on the need and the potential role of treatment for COVID-19 on the African continent? And also, how concerned are you that we may repeat some of the failures around equitable access when it comes to therapeutics, much like we've seen with vaccines?
Thank you very much, Dr. Tatanji. Thank you very much for having me. It is such an honor to be here on this panel with these fabulous panelists, and also to have women in science speaking about equity, because when we talk about equity and justice, we need to speak about equity with COVID, and we also need to move to the gender dimension of global equity. My comment is that the COVID pandemic is the graveyard, I think, of global solidarity and international cooperation. It is where global solidarity went to die, sadly. In the last year and a half, 2 years, we have seen that all the gains that we've made in the past 50 or so years in the multilateral world are being rolled back as we have this nationalism and this pushing out of those who have not, and the increasing push forward of those who have. I agree with Dr. Kearney, where she talked about we mustn't forget about diagnostics and therapeutics. And yes, I, for one, have been incredibly vocal about the need for vaccines. You see, the reason why we haven't heard so much about diagnostics and therapeutics from, as you say, from African leaders or low-income country leaders is almost that many of them have given up. We have given up because we got lost in the race for vaccines, and we absolutely were already lost in the race for diagnostics and therapeutics. The lack of diagnostics is why the world has used the excuse that Africa is not badly affected by COVID-19 as reason for not giving us vaccines in an equitable, in a fair manner, and at the same time and the same rate as they've been distributed around the rest of the world. The lack of diagnostics is the reason why South Africa is thought to be the most affected country on the continent, because they actually have the best health systems and the best access to diagnostics and therapeutics and healthcare. So you're able to measure deaths better, you're able to measure cases better. The lack of diagnostics is the reason why Africa is probably the super variant incubator of the world at the moment. When I say that, I mean, we're not testing. Most countries are not testing, only for travel in many instances. My country, Nigeria, I had to travel a couple of weeks ago. I have to travel this week to go to the World Health Summit in Berlin. That test will cost me the equivalent of $150 US. It hurts my pocket, and I'm considered one of the 1%, or even maybe the 1% of the 1%. So how on earth are people, the average person on the street, supposed to access a diagnostic test? There are no rapid diagnostic tests in most African countries. Ms. Pace and I were together at the Act Accelerated the other day, where I raised this issue and where we raised it quite vociferously, that there are no rapid diagnostic tests. How are people supposed to know that they're sick? Never mind, go to hospital to seek treatment for therapeutics that you mentioned. It is only in most countries when you're traveling, or which is private, and again, there's some serious price gouging going on and some exploitation of the poor. It is only when people are traveling, or when they're an extremist, when they're in the final stages of life and their families have been forced to take them to a tertiary health center where there is government testing available, where you're able to get access to diagnostics. So there has been no equity in diagnostics, and therefore there's been no equity in vaccines. And therefore we know that there is not going to be no equity in therapeutics. There is already no access to therapeutics. There's no equity, because in most countries people are dying for want of a gasp of breath. They're dying for want of oxygen, and they're dying for want of the most basic drugs that we already have available. We're hearing that Britain in the last few days has already secured 480,000 courses of the Merck's new drug, the molnupiravir. I probably have massacred the name. They'll have to forgive me for that one. And Pfizer, we know, is also in trials with their oral drug for COVID, which is PF0731332, which is administered alongside an already existing HIV drug. So you already can see where we're going with that one, because 20 years ago with HIV, we dealt with access to drugs, the antiretrovirals. So now we're going to be dealing with COVID with more retrovirals that Africa and other low-income countries of the world will not have access to. It is critical. You talked, the previous speaker, I think you mentioned monoclonal antibodies. That's a joke. That is a joke. People are talking about Regeneron and monoclonal antibodies. In African countries, low-income countries in the Pacific region, Fiji, other parts of the world, nobody even knows that these exist. People are literally trying to survive on buying oxygen cylinders and putting them in their homes so that they can attach a mask to their face just so for want of a breath so that they can live. Not to alleviate symptoms, not to cure them of this awful, awful disease, but just so that they can breathe and maybe hope to live another day. So absolutely, this panel could not come at a better time. We cannot just agitate for equitable access to vaccines. We must agitate for equitable access to diagnostics, which may be a bit late, but we continue to push. And I know WHO are recently rolling out about 200,000 for 200 million for the African continent, but also agitate for equitable access to these new drugs that are coming up. Let us not make the mistakes of the past. I know Asia Pacific and Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea have already gotten themselves in the front of the queue for Merck's drug. But it is now that we and I thank all of you at DNDi, we need to begin to speak forcefully about the need to ensure that therapies get to those in low-income countries of the world. Thank you.
Incredibly well said, Dr. Lakija. Thank you so much for that. And turning on to Ms. Space, could you please share with us what the US government's perspectives are on the need for diagnostics and therapeutics in addition to vaccines for COVID-19, and what the US government is doing, especially to ensure greater access to treatments through investments into research and development for COVID-19 and for other pandemic threats?
Well, thank you for having me join you all today. It's really hard to follow Yodi because she's always quite inspiring and I find spot on in her remarks. But in response to your question, this is something the US has recognized ourselves and have been quite vocal about just in the past month. I know that a lot of the headlines around the work that we're doing and trying to lead has been focused on vaccines, but we recognize that the public health response is more comprehensive than vaccines alone, and we can't vaccinate ourselves out of this pandemic, especially when there still remains a lack of access to those innovations. And so we have very much committed to also filling the pipeline with other innovations beyond vaccines that could be helpful to the world. And so I do want to come back to that part of the equation, sort of upstream development of these very innovations, and the fact that the US continues to invest in research or science that can help answer this question. How can we better diagnose and treat COVID-19? We see that as also a very important part of the equity agenda, because it could be very easy for countries who have vaccinated a majority of their populations to say, okay, we're done, our work is finished, and we know that that's not true, and we know that that is, not borderline irresponsible for us to take that stance. And so I'm proud that our National Institutes of Health and other agencies have made a commitment to continuing that R&D. But this question of access obviously is also critically important, and as Yodi said, we stand proudly in the multilateral space, working with institutions or organizations like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, like WHO, like others who are really trying to answer this question about how we get innovations to those in need. And that's something that came through in the summit our president hosted this past month, where again, we didn't only talk about vaccines or vaccinations, although that was and remains a critical part of this conversation, but we talked about the importance of scaling up therapeutics and diagnostics. And I'm happy to get into some of those targets that we set, but essentially we said to both governments, especially governments who are in a position to help, as well as industry leaders, hey, we have to raise the bar in these areas, and we can't let recent history repeat itself with diagnostics and therapeutics the way that we've seen this play out with vaccines themselves. And so we remain committed to answering this question, to hearing from you all what more we could do as a government and collectively with others to sort of learn, continue to learn our lesson in real time in COVID-19. And again, I'm grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pace. So we have really set the stage about the inequity around vaccines and how that risk happening with therapeutics. And, you know, the therapeutics are here. So it's not about talking about addressing this in some far distant future. And I'd like to turn back to Dr. Kinney to ask specifically, you know, we know that the new antiviral molnupiravir that has been developed by Merck is in the process of requesting approvals, not only in the United States, but in Europe and in other parts of the world. What steps need to be taken to ensure that companies are able to share their technology and know-how and ensure sufficient supply and equitable access to all low and middle income countries, including low middle income countries, which sometimes get lost in the equation because they're kind of in that in-between space? What are we going to do that these drugs that are coming through right now to make sure that companies are ensuring that there is equitable access to these drugs?
Thanks a lot. This is indeed a very important question. And with a Merck drug in particular, we have first to see whether the data, what it is, whether we can say that it will be appropriate or not to use at a large scale. We hope it will be, since a single pill that can be taken early in the course of infection is exactly the sort of tool that we need to prevent disease progression and the need for hospitalization. Of course, there will be challenges with this drug because and a few others which are also in the pipeline, because we need to make sure that the patients are diagnosed early enough to be able to benefit from these drugs. Indeed, molnupiravir in particular should be taken within 5 days of symptom onset. And therefore, there will be a need to not only ensure access to the drug, but also to ensure access to diagnostics to make sure that those who can benefit from this drug are diagnosed on time to be able to get it early enough for it to be effective. We are very happy to see that Merck has negotiated with several generic companies in India to be able to produce generic versions if and when it is approved. In addition, the Medicines Patent Pool, of whom I am the chair of the board, is also in discussion with Merck to get a voluntary license on molnupiravir. But as we know, this does not address all the challenges, since, as you just said, not all countries are usually included in voluntary licenses. And as we know, that the vast majority of poor people in the world is actually living in middle-income countries. So this is one of the reasons why DNDi is supportive of a waiver on intellectual property called for by a few countries like India or South Africa, the so-called TRIPS waiver, which would cover all health technologies and tools and not only vaccines. Indeed, it is important and that we remove any risk of IP infringement, because otherwise generic manufacturers may not dare go and produce generic drugs, and therefore they may not become available, be developed and become available promptly. But in the long run, although there is no one silver bullet for how to ensure access, it will be important that governments, particularly those that fund R&D, because it gives them a leverage, place clear and transparent terms of condition in their contractual agreements that will guarantee access and that they compel sharing of know-how and technology where needed. Companies owning COVID-19 technologies also need to increase their contribution and commit to either not enforcing their existing IP or to sharing relevant know-how, technology, and IP by non-exclusively licensing it to interested parties. So this is exactly what the mRNA vaccine hub, technology transfer hub, recently established by WHO and ACTA partners in South Africa is attempting to do. Negotiate voluntary license on the IP that Moderna has or may have in South Africa, and through transfer of know-how from a number of entities who have been able to establish the production of mRNA vaccine in quite a number of countries, to develop a copy, if I may say, of what is very effective in terms of new COVID vaccine, in order to be able to transfer this technology downstream to other manufacturers. So we call upon the manufacturers to likewise share their IP, share their know-how, and to all countries to make sure that in their contract, they are provisioned to make this not only a charitable goal, but also a mandated responsibility. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties neatly when we're talking about the landscape and ensuring that there are negotiations with pharmaceutical companies to ensure that there's transfer of technology and access. We can't have these conversations without getting the perspective of the WHO. So I'd like to ask this question to Dr. Simao. What concretely is WHO doing at the moment to anticipate the approval of these new treatments that are coming down the pike? And also, what is the WHO doing in order to support countries so that they're able to scale up access, not only for the treatments, but as Dr. Kine mentioned, in order for some of these treatments to really be effective, you also have to be able to get people tested quickly enough and identify those who are sick and most likely to benefit. So Dr. Simao, welcome and thanks for joining us. And could you please just comment on what the WHO is doing in preparation for these drugs?
Thank you very much, Dr. Tindanji. And apologies for coming in late. I was on a meeting, one of the pharma companies, discussing equitable access and what does it mean for the next year, and how do we ensure that we have these specific products available, affordable, and mostly available and affordable, right? But also equitably distributed. So that's why I'm a bit late to run. No, I think you all know, I'll be very brief, because WHO does have several roles, right? That goes from the establishing the target product profiles to establishing the guidelines for the use, right? Which is I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And also in terms of supporting countries directly on the uptake. And just complementing to Maripo, hello Maripo, I haven't seen you in a while, good to see you. No, WHO also runs a mechanism that's called CTAP, which is the COVID Technology Access Pool, which is a mechanism for the sharing of technology transfer and know-how, and also sharing licensing through the medicines patent pool in a non-exclusive environment, right? And I'm happy to say we will very soon announce the first diagnostics to be licensed ever through the medicines patent pool under CTAP. So this is quite good work that's happening in the future. And we expect that when you're talking about availability and affordability, we need to have more producers of the therapeutics, right? It's proving to be more difficult than the vaccines. So right now, what do we have? We have several therapeutics under assessment. WHO already assessed and recommended, of course, oxygen and dexamethasone, but also the Regeneron cocktail and the tocilizumab and sarilumab. Now, the other part of it is how do we ensure that there is access and it's affordable and sustainable to this product. We have established during this pandemic a different way of working, and we have this living guidelines process, right? And right now, the average between the time the evidence is available, because we need molnupiravir, Maripol, we have not seen any of the data yet. We are expecting to see data from MSD tomorrow. We have a meeting, the guideline people have a meeting with Merck to see the data. Everyone is doing all this big fuss about molnupiravir. We only the press statement from the industry. And there are limitations to that. Of course, we very much want a small molecule that can be produced in several places in the world that can be available, but it has to work, and we need to see that data. Right, so that's so let me say that for the molnupiravir, the guidance development group had a meeting scheduled today. It's a little bit postponed because we are getting the data from MSD tomorrow. We also have this JAK inhibitor, canines, I think, kinase inhibitors that are being assessed by the WHO guideline group, and it's going to be assessed on the 28th of October. The data is being presented, and the group meets to see whether and then we also have the GSK monoclonal antibody coming up, sotrovimab, which is going to be assessed beginning of November. And how does this trigger? Because the other piece that's very important, we're talking with this pharma company right now, it's extremely important to ensure that countries can access any product, is that it has received a WHO pre-qualification, right? Because that, because of the reliance mechanism and so on, facilitates the market entry at country level a lot, and facilitates global procurement. Right? So the way we're doing right now, we only issue an expression of interest for a drug to be pre-qualified once the GGG give us the help. Not say go ahead because it's looking promising. Okay, so we cannot do there are too many drugs being researched right now. Right, so we are focusing on DGG gives a heads up, and we do the expression of it. So we have an expression of interest for the monoclonal antibodies, and we have an expression of interest for small molecules under WHO right now. I think I'll stop here, because the other point that we are working, and this is a work that's done together, of course, with the FDA partners, and the meeting I was in right now was Unity. With Unity is the piece of once you know it works, you need to make sure the price is adequate, right?
Absolutely.
And we need to understand the availability, because it's a more complicated market than it's vaccines right now. The therapeutics are more opaque. I'll stop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Simao. Now, we have been talking a lot about the challenges that we faced with making these drugs accessible, making vaccines accessible. I'd like to turn back to Dr. Alakija and just to get your thoughts on, because the current global response has been so criticized and has had so many flaws and has not really been able to rise up and respond in the way in which we would have hoped, what kind of architecture do you think will be needed to continue managing the COVID response moving forward? And not only for COVID, this is certainly not the last pandemic that we're going to see. There will be future pandemics, and we clearly need to rethink how that global response architecture looks like. So what do you think would be a better approach that could work and not be sort of mirror what we've experienced with the current pandemic? And this
Thank you. Well, clearly this pandemic and the lack of equity and access to the tools, be they diagnostics, therapeutics, or vaccines, has laid bare the fractures and the failures in this current global health system. We have a global health system and a global, quite frankly, a global aid and development system at the moment that is not fit for purpose. It was created post-World War II. It was not non-inclusive. It was created to treat some of those of us in the parts of the, in low-income countries, Africa and other parts of the world as second or third class citizens. We were not included in the decision-making. We were not included in the implementation. The charity model is what we had from post-World War II, and clearly that charity model can no longer continue. COVID has shown us that. COVAX was brilliant in concept. It was totally flawed in its execution, in its governance design. So we cannot continue like this. The definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The world is led by the institutions that govern how we live or die, that decide whether myself or my cousin or my sister or my mother or my aunt, uncle, father live or die, are predominantly man-made, male-led institutions that are based out of the global north. So how do we go about this? We have to turn things on its head, and we have to begin to include the voices from the global south, not just when they make us uncomfortable, as I know that mine has done, and so people are now beginning to include that in conversations. It's not just when they make us uncomfortable, it's not just in a time of crisis, but we have to take the opportunity in this crisis as a global community and recognize that what we have at the moment is broken. It is fundamentally broken, it is fundamentally flawed, and we have to fix it by reordering. We need not a review of global health systems, we need a reform of global health systems. We need a reform of the global aid architecture. We need your voice, Boguma, and my voice, and Lois's voice, and others of us. We need our voices clearly at the table. We cannot be dictated to any further. We're talking now and hearing some wonderful information from Dr. Simao about the therapies available and the trials with all these wonderful drugs and the monoclonal antibodies and the antiretrovirals. To those of us in Africa and other low-income countries of the world, you might as well be speaking double Dutch and Greek all rolled into one, because those things do not apply to us. So until we have a world where you are having a conversation that I can understand, not just because I'm a physician or in this global health space, but because I'm a person on the street who understands my own right to a monoclonal antibody and knows that I can walk to the health center and get it, then the system is broken. The system is broken because the governance is broken. Lois spoke to multilateralism and the fact that, they're part of our multilateral system. There are cries that we need African reform, continents need to go it alone. I also disagree with that. We need reform, but we cannot go it alone. We need to strengthen the multilateralism so that it is not multilateralism for America, for UK, for EU, for the people of the global north, but that it is multilateral for all of us, so that there is not a celebration when a Tedros is made the head of WHO because he's a Black African man, because it is just normal. I remember when I graduated medical school, nobody went to my graduation ceremony because my father looked at me and said, "What did you do that was special? This is the least that is expected of you," and that is where we need to get to when women ascend to these places. And I now speak to women as well. We need women in charge. The countries that have had women in charge of the pandemic have done so much better. You look at what is going on in some countries of the world where they're beginning to talk about lockdowns again. Again, I say the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again. But who suffers? It is us who suffer. It is us in the lower income countries of the world who suffer. So I can bet you that, somebody, I think it was Dr. Keeley who just said earlier on that before these drugs can be effective, the therapeutics can be effective, they need to be applied within 5 days of diagnostics. So you might as well not bother to bring it to Africa because there are no tests in Africa. So why bother? Keep your drug there and help us find the basics of oxygen and the basics of dexamethasone. Even dexamethasone, I have friends who have paid over $40,000, 10 to 20 million naira in hospital fees in this pandemic. The only people who live in Nigeria are those who have $40,000, and often they're asked to pay a deposit of 5 to 10 million naira upfront before the hospital will even admit them. This is inequity, a lack of access gone crazy. We're not hearing those stories because nobody is listening to our voices. We need more of our voices at the table, and we need a fundamental shift in the way the world do things. So I call on DNDi, I call on the president and your leadership at DNDi and president of Medicine Patents Pool. We need you to join our voices with ours and say enough is enough. This global system is broken. We cannot move forward until we change Gavi, we change SEPI, we change Act Accelerator, we bring more voices of the lower income countries to the table. And, you know, we want to thank also the US government. I have to say that thank God for President Biden, because had we been having this conversation last year, we all would be dead. You know, but thank God that President Biden's administration has come to the table and has been the only G7 country so far to really meet commitments in giving vaccines. So now I call on Lois and I say, please bring that energy to diagnostics, bring that energy to therapeutics, bring that energy to the equity conversation, because we need health justice and we need equity and we need it now. This lovely, sober, scientific conversations we're having them, but people are dying and we cannot continue to have that happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you articulate a frustration that a lot of people who've signed into this webinar feel, because oftentimes it's felt during this pandemic as it's been a lot of talk and very little of that talk actually translating into concrete actions that are trickling down to the resources that people need in their spaces to be able to fight this pandemic. So I thank you for that. And I think it leads very nicely back to Ms. Pace, just because I think one of the questions that frequently comes up, the US is such an important key player, the US government, in this space, in being able to broker, being able to lead in terms of addressing the inequity that has been the main flaw of this pandemic. There is a question coming in from one of our audience members to you, talking about and wanting to know from you how concretely the US government is planning on leveraging the significant investments that it's made in therapeutics to ensure equitable access. And the audience member asking this question gives the example of the fact that the US government invested significantly in vaccine development with companies such as Moderna, and these companies received a lot of funding from the US government, but yet we've seen that it's been a little bit more challenging to then move these companies into the space where they're more willing to share their technology and share those resources with the world once we have a finished product. So how is the US government going to ensure that in the space of therapeutics, while they continue to work on the vaccine aspects as well, that they are leveraging these investments made in big pharma to actually bring these actors to the table in addressing the inequity that's plaguing us in the pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for this question. So these conversations and this particular question is live within our government now. And so unfortunately, I can't give as direct and final a response to this question as we speak, but I'll say this. First off, again, the invitation is open for us to hear from you what we should be doing or what we could be doing, and that's sincere. Because like Yodi said, we need to be listening, and we have been listening, and we've been trying to listen and respond to what we've heard so far. So what I'll say is perhaps speak to ways we've tried to answer this question on the vaccine side. In the event there's some connection or relevance to these other areas in diagnostics and therapeutics. So what we heard is that we need to do business differently. And so Marie-Paul was talking about the IP waiver under consideration at the WTO that was put forth by the governments of India and South Africa. And I think people were surprised to hear from the US that we supported a waiver. And we said this early in our administration, back in May, I believe. And that was an important signal for us to send to say, we will not stand in the way of that kind of conversation because the crisis we're in is too dire and the need is too great for us to be silent. Something else we've heard is the importance of decentralizing, or some might say democratizing, access, and specifically production and manufacturing. And so what we have done is we have invested in places and spaces in South Africa, in India, in Senegal, and elsewhere where they can produce at least vaccines. Now, there's an open question of whether or how we can do something similar with other innovations, but we have shown or tried to demonstrate our commitment to that decentralization, to that expansion of access, and answering that question of supply when it comes to those gaps. And then something else that we have heard and something we've listened to is this overarching question of accountability, right? And the importance of holding both ourselves and our partners, like industry stakeholders, accountable. So we tried to answer that question in a couple of ways. One is coming back to bodies like WHO. The US has been co-chairing this conversation on reform, right? And Yodi spoke powerfully to the importance of us, again, doing business differently. The president talks about building back better. We have to mean that. And there have been conversations that we have co-led with the government of Indonesia and with other member states, looking at how we improve the international health regulations, sure, and the importance of looking again at our governance models in that setting. But another thread that I think or hope people have been following is this very real conversation on equity, because we recognize as a government that that had not been part of the discussion as deliberately, right? And as has been said, we can talk about regulations, we can talk about governance and accountability, but that doesn't mean much to people who don't spend their days and lives in multilateral forums. What people do understand, and what I know my people understand, who also, frankly, there are communities in the US who lack access to these tests and treatments, right? And so what resonates with them even is this question or conversation about how we close those gaps and what we're going to do beyond these international norms or standards to truly address inequities. And so there have been proposals put on the table in that form that are part of the discussion. And it was great to have the meeting as recently as this week that included non-state actors who were, again, informing that process, informing how WHO member states need to really address some of these issues around scale and production, around distribution or delivery, and everything in between. The final thing I'll offer, and this is very specific to industry that came out in this summit the president hosted, was a call to action for transparency and a dashboard that looks at what truly is available. You know, what industry is producing and where it's going. Now, this was specific to vaccines, but hopefully it serves as a model and an expectation, frankly, of what we see from all stakeholders. We all have to be much more transparent and clear about what truly is available and where it's going, so that we can resolve this tension and this very real, I'm searching for the word, right? But inequity, frankly, around where we have life-saving innovations and where we don't, and correct that imbalance. So hopefully that's, again, something that gives the person who asked this question, a very important one, a sense of at least our thinking and the direction we're going based on where we've been on vaccines. But once again, I invite any and all proposals. Thank you.
Just a very quick follow-up to that, and thank you so much for taking the time to really lay out what the U.S. government is doing to rethink how business is done, right? And I think that it's important to talk about TRIPS waivers here. I know that the U.S. has been very supportive of a narrow TRIPS waiver pertaining to COVID vaccines. Do you think that as we kind of continue to think about ways in which to translate our words into actions, rethinking how we do business, that we can envisage a scenario where the US government is able to broaden that TRIPS waiver to include diagnostics and therapeutics? Because as we've clearly seen, all of these things go hand in hand. So we can't just be focusing on vaccines alone.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. And I don't have an answer for you that involves agencies beyond mine for sure. But it's a really important question. And it's a reason why we have been vocal not only about an IP waiver, but also about voluntary tech transfer. I know that's something else that I think Maria Angela really focused on in her remarks. And so recognizing, yes, this has to be a part of a spectrum, whether we're talking about expansion from vaccines to diagnostics and therapeutics, or whether we're talking about, other than IP, the other essential pieces that need to be a part of that equation. And so we have been open about our support for voluntary tech transfer, as well as just really accelerating clinical trials and ensuring that we're sharing that data globally, truly, and not just among certain countries or nations. So that those are ways we're trying to extend our support and reach. And we take this suggestion, if I can take it as a suggestion, under advisement, certainly, for us to consider broadening our support of a waiver as well. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Turning back.
Can I come in that question?
Yes, please. Actually,
can you hear me now?
just before you come in, can I just ask the question that I was going to direct to you, and then maybe your response would tie in with that. So talking back to the WHO and what the WHO has been doing, you know, the WHO has been very vocal, trying to get increase in vaccine equity, and Dr. Tedros has spoken about it, called for moratoria on boosters. Yet, member states have largely ignored what WHO has recommended in terms of ways in which to help improve equity around vaccines. Do you think that this situation will be any different when it comes to treatment? And what can the WHO do differently to really hold member states to be responsible and hold them to account, so that they are not contributing to the problem of inequity so far as vaccines are concerned, but also when it comes to therapeutics?
That's a very good question. And I think they are tied. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. No, because apologies for the colleagues who couldn't hear me well online, because I had a problem with the computer and it crashed, and I have a new one that I don't know how to use yet. So I think a quick remark on complementing highlights on the TRIPS waiver, because WHO is a firm supporter of the TRIPS waiver, right? And although we have the mechanisms in place to facilitate the voluntary licensing, and our big partner is the Medicines Patent Pool, but the DG from WHO has been very vocal in saying, if not now, when? You know, and this is actually, we always say, because what we hear of the opposer or the opponents of the waiver is that, oh, it won't help that sort of situation now. You know, but in 2 years from now, we'll be in the same place. Oh, it won't happen now. You know, so it has to happen now so that we'll be ready for the next time. That's one point. On the equity, you know, that and I was listening in, and the issue of the colleague from AVAT made a beautiful speech on the inequity in business as usual, right? And what we are seeing is, although people say it's not business as usual, I always say that the problems we had with access, affordable, equitable access to everything that's in that health products in general, just were made worse through this pandemic, right? What was bad became worse. So what we really need is that there is a change in behavior. We're going to see the same thing with therapeutics, Boguma. We're going to see the same thing with the therapeutics that we're seeing with vaccines, because, you know, in vaccines we see companies prioritizing bilateral agreements that pay more, right? Companies not prioritizing the global or regional, like COVAX and AVAX, even though you have signed contracts, but the deliveries happen to countries that have bilateral agreements before they happen to COVAX and AVAX. So we need a change in behavior in companies to prioritize delivery to the global mechanism or the regional mechanism. But we also need countries, and here, let me say that US has been leading on the donation, but there are other countries who are also responding well to those sharing, which is actually the donations of the vaccines that were contracted. We wouldn't have that problem if the bilateral agreements hadn't skewed the balance to start with. But now we need to sort it out, and we can't sort it out equity in vaccines if we have countries that have pledged donations, delivering on them, and I am saying that the US has been very good at this. Other countries are working with COVAX and WHO on this as well. What do I see for the therapeutics? I see so far that we have approved, WHO has put on the guidelines monoclonal antibodies, right? Which it's not because WHO wants to put them, it's because the evidence is there that it helps decrease mortality. And now we have the possibility of a small molecule. Monoclonal antibodies, we have a chronic problem with access. You know that, right? It's controlled with few manufacturers. And even tocilizumab, who's not under patent, in the vast majority of countries, there are no biosimilars in the market. You see, so we need to tackle the issues of the biotherapeutics, and we've been discussing this with the Medicines Patent Pool as well. During COVID and beyond COVID, because it's always restricted to a smaller number of manufacturers who don't want to share technology and who don't want to share IP, who don't want to share anything, and availability is very low. So the efforts we're doing right now is to ensure that the global production, there is that low-income countries and middle-income countries are not left behind because of the contracts that are being done in high-income countries.
Thank you. And I will now move around just to give our panelists, because we're running short of time. And again, I want to thank those who joined us for your fantastic questions. We're able to get those into our panelists, but just to give an opportunity to our panelists to give some closing remarks before we bring this webinar to its end, to a close. And I'll start with Dr. Ayoade, please.
Thank you very much. I had my hand up because I had that as well. When we talk about
there might be an issue with Dr. Ayoade's connection. I think we would move on to Dr. Kine, and then when she comes back, we'll get her comments. Dr. Kine, please, could you please give us your closing remarks?
Thanks a lot. Well, to summarize a lot of discussion, I think that we should rejoice and celebrate the fantastic advancement of science, which has made it that in a record time, we have had diagnostics and vaccines, which are very efficacious, developed and deployed on a large scale. We should also be happy to see that drugs are coming now to fruition. We're discussing small molecules. We're also discussing monoclonal antibodies, and this is excellent news. But in the face of all this success, we must recognize that the world so far has been very equitable in allowing access to these life-saving drugs, diagnostics, and I hope, well, vaccine diagnostic, and I hope very soon drugs, and that something must be done very urgently to ensure that the success of science is accompanied by a success of access. And it is our joint responsibility to advocate for that, to try new initiatives. As I said, I'm very happy that I have an opportunity to participate in the tech transfer hub for mRNA vaccine, which was set up in South Africa and has the support of many countries beyond South Africa, of course, which is the most important. And but we need all to join up so that our collective success at the end of a pandemic will not only be on science, but will also be on access. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ms. Pace, could you please give us your concluding comments?
Of course, I'll just say, look, I appreciate that the panelists and perhaps other in the audience recognize the work that the U.S. has been really trying to do to not just sort of consider this question, but actually be a part of the solution. But we recognize that we still have more to do, and we continue to try and press ourselves towards progress. And we also recognize it's not just going to take us if we're doing it right. And so whether we can apply pressure or otherwise encourage our government partners around the world to step into this space with us, or even work hand in hand with non-governmental actors to ensure that we collectively are making progress, we stand ready to do that. I think we also recognize that this conversation and the very solutions need to be led by other people with other ideas and ideals as well. And so to the degree, just as much as we are standing ready to lead, I think we also very much are standing ready to follow to a degree, and recognize that this is, as much advancements as we can make in innovations, none of it matters unless we can ensure that everyone has access to what's available to saving lives. And so I hope that you all receive that with the humility with which I'm trying to offer it on behalf of our government, and know that I'm very grateful for the work that each of you on this screen and joining us today does in this fight. It's very important to all of us here.
Thank you. Dr. Simao, your closing comments. Your mic is muted.
Yes. Thank you. And apologies again for arriving late, but I think it's very clear to all of us that vaccines is an important tool, but it's not the only tool, right? We still need the public health and social measures in place. We are seeing the resurgence of cases in countries that have 80% of vaccination, right? And we see, and I actually, let me say to DNDi that I love the title of this webinar, right? Another triumph for science by a defeat for access. I think this is the question we need to beat every single day and make sure it's not a defeat for access. No, and this depends a lot on how we collectively push this forward. There is a discussion now at the World Health Assembly, the special session at the end of November. Now will be a discussion on a pandemic treaty or another type of agreement, international agreement, that would allow the world to be better prepared next time. I think you hear about it because this is a very important discussion, because it creates the mechanisms for the accountability of all partners, not only member states, but everyone who's engaged in the health sector and who has to have responsibilities and be accountable in a crisis like the one we are. Yeah. So I always like to say it's not over, but it will be over. And I say that I expect by the next pandemic, I'll be at home waiting for my vaccine. And that younger people like those who are in the audience will be taking the equitable access agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think Yodi has been able to reconnect.
Yeah.
Yes, over to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, what I was saying is we need to compel Big Pharma. We need to employ whatever legal instruments are available on that point. But to sort of close, I want to also say that the world is dealing with what is an emergency crisis situation as though it's a developmental issue. We're not treating it with the fierce urgency of now that it needs. We're dealing with it on a day-to-day, business as usual. And that, I think, partly is because, it is only the person who is wearing the shoe, as we say in my language, that knows where it is pinching their feet. Because those of us who are feeling the lack of access are not at the table, those of you who are at the table, who have access, can have gentle, quiet conversations about it. But we cannot wait, and people are dying. So we need to press on the fierce urgency of now. And I call on, Lois and the US government, who representing the US government today, to take that leadership role that they've already been taken and to bring that urgency to the fore. The other thing that I want to say is that accountability, when we talk about emergency crisis situations, we also need to find those who know how to deal with emergencies. So where are the Médecins Sans Frontières of this world? Where are the Dr. Joanne Liu's of this world who know how to deal with an emergency crisis situation, bring them to the table and ask them what to do. Because those of you who've been dealing with regular sort of development, routine immunization, et cetera, don't necessarily know what to do when there's a war, when there's a global war, when there's a global crisis. I think we need more crisis managers at the table, and we have enough of those people in this world, you know, who can come to the table and can tell us that, well, maybe we need to shift in this direction. And finally, we need accountability. Accountability is key, but there can be no accountability without consequences. And right now, failure to deliver should be met with consequences, because the failure to deliver within the multilateral system means death in my household. 3-4 weeks ago, I lost members of my household to COVID who could not be vaccinated, who could not access diagnostics, who could not access therapeutics. A 35-year-old woman who dropped dead overnight because nobody knew she had COVID and she couldn't breathe. That is what failure to deliver means in Africa. So why does it not mean something in the halls of Geneva or Washington, D.C. or New York? There need to be consequences. We need consequences for failure to deliver. And we need the world to push for those consequences. Otherwise, people are not motivated to do the right thing. I want to thank all my fellow panelists. It's just been wonderful to be here with you all today. Wonderful to see Lois and to see everyone else. And Buguma, great job. Thank you very much all for listening to me. Please help us. Please ensure we have access to diagnostics and to therapeutics in the low-income countries of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And what amazing words with which to conclude. Really not much else to add except thanking all the fantastic panelists for joining. A lot for us to think about. And the words that I retain from this are urgency, the time is now, rethinking the way we do business, and being more intentional about translating the words into concrete actions, because actual human lives depend on this. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists.